Step out of the vehicle, ma'am.
Officer, I have not been drinking. I passed your tests.
I smell marijuana. I'm searching the vehicle.
You have no probable cause.
Turn around, you're under arrest.
I am a federal judge. This is a serious mistake.
Yeah, sure.
The dashboard camera was already rolling when Officer Michael Stevens spotted the silver sedan traveling down Maple Street at exactly 3:47 on that Tuesday afternoon. What began as what appeared to be a routine traffic stop in the quiet suburban neighborhood of Westfield would spiral into a federal case that would cost the city nearly $1 million and destroy one man's career forever. The woman behind the wheel had no idea that she was about to become the center of a story that would expose years of misconduct, spark national outrage, and prove that sometimes justice comes with a price tag that some people simply cannot afford to ignore. Before we dive into this incredible story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button because trust me, you won't want to miss how this unfolds. The woman driving that vehicle was Judge Angela Washington, a 52-year-old federal judge who had spent the last 15 years presiding over some of the most important cases in the district. She was brilliant, respected, and had worked her way up from a public defender to the federal bench through sheer determination and an unwavering commitment to justice. That afternoon, she was simply driving home from the courthouse after a long day of hearings, looking forward to a quiet evening with her family. Judge Washington had lived in Westfield for over a decade. She knew the neighborhood well, had attended community meetings, and had even spoken at the local high school's career day. Her house sat on a tree-lined street where neighbors knew each other by name and children played safely in front yards. It was the kind of place where nothing dramatic ever happened, where the biggest news was usually about the annual block party or someone's new garden renovation. Officer Michael Stevens had been with the Westfield Police Department for 12 years. He was 38 years old, married with 2 kids, and lived just 2 towns over. On paper, he looked like a decent cop with a clean record and commendations for community service. But what the personnel files didn't show was a pattern of behavior that had been carefully hidden, overlooked, or explained away by supervisors who preferred to keep things quiet rather than deal with uncomfortable truths. That Tuesday afternoon started like any other for both of them. Judge Washington had wrapped up a complex securities fraud case, reviewed briefs for the following week, and made her usual stop at the courthouse coffee shop before heading to her car. Officer Stevens was on patrol in Sector 7, the affluent part of town where calls were typically about noise complaints or minor fender benders. Neither of them could have predicted that their paths would cross in a way that would change everything. The speed limit on Maple Street was 35 miles per hour. Judge Washington was driving 37. 2 miles over the limit, the kind of minor infraction that most officers would ignore, especially in a residential area where traffic was light and no one was in danger. But Officer Stevens didn't ignore it. According to the dash cam footage that would later become crucial evidence, he immediately activated his lights and began following the vehicle. Judge Washington noticed the police car behind her and felt that familiar flutter of anxiety that even law-abiding citizens experience when they see flashing lights in their rearview mirror. She checked her speedometer, realized she might have been going slightly over the limit, and carefully pulled over to the side of the road. She put her car in park, turned off the engine, and placed her hands on the steering wheel where they would be clearly visible. After years in the criminal justice system, she knew exactly how these interactions were supposed to go. Officer Stevens approached the driver's side window with his hand resting on his service weapon. This was his first red flag. Department protocol called for a relaxed approach during minor traffic violations, not the aggressive stance typically reserved for high-risk stops. Judge Washington rolled down her window and waited calmly for the officer to speak. The conversation that followed was captured entirely on the officer's body camera, though that footage wouldn't surface until much later. Officer Stevens asked for her license and registration without explaining why he had stopped her. Judge Washington politely asked what the reason for the stop was, a perfectly reasonable question that any driver has the right to ask. Stevens told her to just provide her documents and stop asking questions. Judge Washington handed over her driver's license and vehicle registration. Her license clearly identified her as a federal judge, complete with the official designation that should have immediately changed the tone of the interaction. Stevens looked at the license for several seconds, long enough to read every detail, but his demeanor didn't soften. If anything, he seemed to become more aggressive. Here's where the story takes its first disturbing turn. Instead of recognizing that he was dealing with a federal judge and adjusting his approach accordingly, Officer Stevens appeared to be irritated by her credentials. He asked her if the license was real, implying that she might be using fake identification. Judge Washington, maintaining her composure despite the obvious insult, calmly confirmed that yes, the license was authentic, and she was indeed a federal judge. Stevens then did something that no reasonable officer would do during a routine traffic stop. He ordered Judge Washington out of her vehicle. She asked why this was necessary for a minor speeding violation, pointing out that she had been cooperative and provided all requested documentation. Stevens raised his voice and repeated his command, adding that if she didn't comply immediately, she would be arrested for obstruction. Judge Washington knew her rights better than most people in America. She knew that ordering someone out of their vehicle during a routine traffic stop required reasonable suspicion of criminal activity or officer safety concerns, neither of which existed in this situation. But she also knew that arguing with an aggressive police officer on the side of the road was dangerous, especially given the growing tension in the interaction. She complied with the order and stepped out of her car. Once she was standing beside her vehicle, Stevens told her to put her hands on the hood and spread her legs. Judge Washington was shocked. This was the position used for searching suspects who were being arrested, not for citizens receiving traffic citations. She asked what she was being arrested for, since no crime had been committed. Stevens didn't answer her question directly. Instead, he said she was being detained for investigation. The body camera footage shows Judge Washington standing with her hands on her car, maintaining her dignity despite the humiliating circumstances. She remained calm and respectful, even as Stevens began what can only be described as an unnecessary and invasive search. He patted her down thoroughly, checking her pockets, her jacket, even her shoes. The search revealed nothing illegal or dangerous, just the normal items anyone might carry. A phone, car keys, a small purse with a wallet, and some cash. But Stevens wasn't finished. He told Judge Washington that he needed to search her vehicle for contraband. She informed him that he had no legal right to search her car without probable cause or her consent, both of which were absent in this situation. Stevens claimed that her refusal to consent was suspicious behavior that gave him the right to search anyway. This was completely false, a violation of basic constitutional law that every police officer is trained to understand. By now, several neighbors had noticed the commotion and had come out to see what was happening. They recognized Judge Washington from community events and were confused about why she was being treated like a criminal. One neighbor, an elderly man named Robert Chen, who lived across the street, started recording the interaction on his phone. When Stevens noticed the recording, he became even more agitated. Quick question for you watching. Have you ever witnessed something like this happening in your own neighborhood? Type yes in the comments if you have. Stevens ordered the neighbor to stop recording and move away from the scene. The neighbor, exercising his legal right to record police activity from a public space, politely refused. Stevens then made a radio call requesting backup, claiming he had an uncooperative suspect and hostile civilians interfering with his investigation. This was the moment when what should have been a simple traffic citation began spiraling completely out of control. Judge Washington remained composed throughout this escalation, but inside, she was processing the full implications of what was happening. As a federal judge, she had seen countless cases involving police misconduct, civil rights violations, and the abuse of power. She understood that she was experiencing firsthand the kind of treatment that too many citizens, particularly people of color, face during routine encounters with law enforcement. The irony was not lost on her that she spent her days ensuring justice was served, only to find herself on the receiving end of injustice. 2 additional police cars arrived within minutes, bringing the total number of officers to 3 for what had started as a minor speeding violation. Judge Washington watched as Stevens spoke quietly with his colleagues, gesturing toward her and the growing crowd of neighbors. She couldn't hear what was being said, but their body language suggested they were planning their next move rather than trying to de-escalate the situation. Officer Janet Rodriguez, one of the responding officers, approached Judge Washington and asked for her side of the story. This gave the judge hope that someone with common sense had arrived to resolve the situation. She calmly explained that she had been stopped for allegedly speeding 2 miles over the limit, had provided all requested documentation, including her federal judge identification, and had been cooperative throughout the encounter. She pointed out that Officer Stevens had escalated the situation unnecessarily and was now detaining her without probable cause. Officer Rodriguez examined Judge Washington's license and registration, noting the federal judge designation. She looked confused and walked back to confer with Stevens. The conversation between the officers was heated, though conducted in low voices. Rodriguez appeared to be questioning Stevens' handling of the situation, while Stevens seemed to be defending his actions and insisting that Judge Washington was being uncooperative. The third officer, Sergeant David Palmer, was the senior person on scene and technically in charge of the situation. He approached Judge Washington and asked her to explain what had happened from the beginning. She repeated her account, maintaining her professional demeanor despite the growing absurdity of the situation. Sergeant Palmer listened carefully, occasionally glancing at Stevens with what appeared to be concern or confusion. What happened next would become the most controversial part of the entire incident and the foundation for the federal lawsuit that would follow. Despite the clear evidence that Judge Washington had done nothing wrong and posed no threat to anyone, Sergeant Palmer made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his career. Instead of immediately releasing her and apologizing for the unnecessary detention, he chose to support Officer Stevens. He told Judge Washington that she was being arrested for obstruction of justice and resisting arrest, charges that had no basis in reality given that she had been cooperative throughout the entire encounter. Judge Washington asked to see the specific actions that constituted obstruction or resistance, since the body camera footage would clearly show her compliance with every lawful order. Sergeant Palmer couldn't provide a satisfactory answer, but the arrest proceeded anyway. She was handcuffed behind her back and placed in the rear of Stevens' patrol car while neighbors watched in disbelief. The sight of a respected federal judge being arrested in her own neighborhood sent shockwaves through the community. Robert Chen continued recording despite repeated orders to stop, capturing footage that would later prove invaluable in court. Other neighbors began taking photos and videos, creating a comprehensive record of what many would later describe as one of the most egregious examples of racial profiling they had ever witnessed. Mrs. Sarah Thompson, who lived next door to Judge Washington, was so disturbed by what she was seeing that she called Judge Washington's husband to inform him of the arrest. She also contacted the local news station, correctly predicting that this story would be of significant public interest. Within hours, the incident would be making headlines across the region. Judge Washington was transported to the Westfield Police Department and processed like any other arrestee. She was photographed, fingerprinted, and placed in a holding cell while officers decided how to handle the situation. The booking officer, a young woman who had only been on the force for 2 years, seemed uncomfortable with the entire process. She had recognized Judge Washington's name from court documents and news articles, and she understood that arresting a federal judge required extraordinary justification. The police department's leadership was in crisis mode. Chief Thomas Bradley received multiple phone calls within the first hour after the arrest, including one from the mayor's office and another from the district attorney. Everyone wanted to know why a federal judge was sitting in their jail cell on charges that appeared to have no merit. Chief Bradley reviewed the body camera footage and dash cam video, and what he saw made his stomach drop. The footage clearly showed Judge Washington being respectful and cooperative throughout the encounter. There was no evidence of obstruction, resistance, or any other criminal behavior. Instead, the video captured Officer Stevens escalating a routine traffic stop into an unnecessary confrontation, apparently triggered by Judge Washington's race and professional status. Chief Bradley realized that his department was facing a potential lawsuit that could bankrupt the city. Judge Washington spent 4 hours in custody before being released on her own recognizance. The charges against her were quietly dropped the following day, but the damage was already done. Word of the arrest had spread throughout the legal community, and federal judges, attorneys, and civil rights activists were demanding answers. The incident had exposed a level of police misconduct that shocked even those familiar with systemic problems in law enforcement. The first lawsuit was filed within a week. Judge Washington, represented by a team of prominent civil rights attorneys, sued Officer Stevens, Sergeant Palmer, Officer Rodriguez, and the city of Westfield for violations of her constitutional rights under the 4th and 14th Amendments. The complaint detailed how she had been subjected to racial profiling, unlawful detention, excessive force, and false arrest without any legitimate law enforcement purpose. The legal discovery process revealed information that made the case even more damning. Officer Stevens' personnel file contained multiple complaints from citizens alleging racial bias and excessive force, but these complaints had been consistently dismissed or resulted in minimal discipline. Internal emails showed that supervisors were aware of Stevens' problematic behavior, but had failed to take corrective action. The department's own data revealed that Stevens stopped black drivers at a rate significantly higher than his colleagues, despite working the same patrol areas. One particularly disturbing piece of evidence was a text message conversation between Stevens and another officer from several months before the incident. In these messages, Stevens made explicitly racist comments about black residents in affluent neighborhoods, suggesting they didn't belong there and were probably involved in criminal activity. The messages showed a clear pattern of racial animus that provided context for his treatment of Judge Washington. The defense strategy employed by the city and the officers was both predictable and ineffective. They claimed that Stevens had acted within his discretionary authority as a police officer, that Judge Washington had been argumentative and uncooperative, and that the arrest was justified based on her alleged behavior. This narrative fell apart when the body camera footage was played in court, showing clearly that Judge Washington had been polite and compliant throughout the encounter. The trial lasted 3 weeks and drew national attention. Legal experts appeared on television programs to discuss the case, and civil rights organizations used it as an example of the ongoing problems with racial bias in policing. The courtroom was packed every day with lawyers, journalists, and community members who wanted to witness this landmark case. Judge Washington's testimony was compelling and dignified. She described the humiliation of being treated like a criminal in her own neighborhood, the fear she felt when Stevens became aggressive, and the broader implications of what had happened to her. She spoke about the countless defendants who had appeared before her with similar stories of police misconduct, and how experiencing it firsthand had given her new perspective on the systemic nature of these problems. Officer Stevens' testimony was a disaster for the defense. Under cross-examination, he was unable to articulate any legitimate reason for escalating the traffic stop. He couldn't explain why he had ordered Judge Washington out of her vehicle, why he had searched her person and property, or why he had arrested her when no crime had been committed. His answers were evasive and contradictory, and he appeared to be making up justifications as he went along. The jury also heard from police training experts who testified that Stevens' actions violated basic principles of professional law enforcement. They explained that traffic stops should be conducted with courtesy and respect, that searches require probable cause or consent, and that arrests should only be made when there is evidence of criminal activity. Stevens' conduct failed every professional standard. Several neighbors testified about what they had witnessed, corroborating Judge Washington's account and contradicting the officer's claims that she had been uncooperative. Their testimony painted a picture of a respected community member being mistreated by police officers who seemed determined to humiliate her, regardless of her compliance with their demands. The most powerful testimony came from other victims of Stevens' misconduct. 3 black citizens who had been stopped and searched by Stevens under similar circumstances described their experiences. Their stories revealed a clear pattern of targeting black drivers for pretextual stops, conducting unnecessary searches, and using minor infractions as justification for harassment and intimidation. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning a verdict in favor of Judge Washington on all counts. They found that the officers had violated her constitutional rights and that the city was liable for failing to properly train and supervise its personnel. The damage award of $830,000 sent a clear message that racial profiling and police misconduct would not be tolerated. The monetary judgment was just the beginning of the consequences that followed. Officer Stevens was terminated immediately after the verdict, and his law enforcement certification was permanently revoked. He would never work as a police officer again, and his actions had made him unemployable in most other fields as well. Sergeant Palmer was demoted and suspended without pay for 6 months, effectively ending any chance of career advancement. Officer Rodriguez, who had failed to intervene when she witnessed obvious misconduct, was also disciplined and required to undergo extensive retraining. Chief Bradley announced his early retirement just days after the verdict, citing the need for new leadership to restore public trust in the department. The mayor established a civilian oversight board to review police practices and implement reforms designed to prevent similar incidents in the future. The city also agreed to pay for comprehensive bias training for all officers and to revise its policies regarding traffic stops and arrests. The case became a catalyst for broader changes in how police departments across the country handled complaints and disciplined officers. Judge Washington used her platform to advocate for criminal justice reform, speaking at conferences and universities about the need for accountability in law enforcement. She established a scholarship fund for law students from underrepresented communities who were committed to pursuing careers in civil rights law. Have you ever been treated unfairly by someone in authority? Let me know in the comments what you think about how this case was handled. The ripple effects of the case continued for years. Several other lawsuits were filed against the Westfield Police Department by citizens who had been mistreated by Stevens and other officers. The federal government launched an investigation into the department's practices, resulting in additional reforms and oversight measures. The incident became a case study in law schools and police academies, used to teach about constitutional rights and professional conduct. For Judge Washington, the experience was both traumatic and transformative. She had always understood intellectually that racial bias existed in the criminal justice system, but experiencing it personally gave her insights that would influence her judicial decisions for the rest of her career. She became more attuned to claims of police misconduct and more willing to scrutinize law enforcement testimony when it seemed inconsistent or implausible. Au Sybil. The incident also sparked changes in how federal judges approached cases involving police misconduct. Judge Washington's colleagues on the bench began asking more pointed questions during hearings where law enforcement testimony seemed questionable. They had witnessed firsthand how a respected federal judge could be subjected to such treatment, and it opened their eyes to the experiences of ordinary citizens who lacked her legal knowledge and professional standing. The media coverage of the case was extensive and largely supportive of Judge Washington. Editorial boards across the country condemned the officer's actions and praised the jury's verdict. However, not everyone was pleased with the outcome. Some law enforcement organizations criticized the damage award as excessive and argued that it would make officers hesitant to do their jobs effectively. These arguments fell flat given the overwhelming evidence of misconduct in this particular case. Judge Washington received hundreds of letters and emails from people sharing their own experiences with police profiling and misconduct. Many thanked her for having the courage to fight back and seek justice, noting that most people in similar situations would have simply accepted the mistreatment and moved on. Her willingness to pursue legal action had given voice to countless others who had suffered similar indignities but lacked the resources or platform to seek accountability. The financial impact on the city was significant but manageable. The $830,000 judgment, combined with legal fees and the cost of implementing reforms, totaled well over $1 million. However, city officials recognized that the long-term cost of allowing such behavior to continue would have been far greater, both financially and in terms of community trust. Officer Stevens struggled to find employment after losing his badge. His name was permanently associated with the case, making him unemployable in law enforcement and most other professions requiring public trust. He eventually moved to another state and took a job in construction, earning a fraction of his former police salary. His family life suffered as well, with the stress of unemployment and public embarrassment contributing to marital problems and financial hardship. The community of Westfield was divided in its response to the incident. While most residents supported Judge Washington and condemned the officer's actions, a vocal minority defended Stevens and claimed he was being unfairly persecuted. These defenders argued that police work was dangerous and that officers should be given the benefit of the doubt when making split-second decisions. However, the body camera footage made it difficult to sustain this argument, as it clearly showed Stevens had plenty of time to assess the situation and choose a different course of action. Judge Washington's husband, Dr. Marcus Washington, a prominent surgeon at the local medical center, became an unexpected advocate for police reform. He had always been politically moderate and had generally supported law enforcement, but seeing his wife treated like a criminal changed his perspective entirely. He began speaking at community meetings and medical conferences about the health impacts of police violence and racial stress on minority communities. The case also highlighted the importance of civilian oversight in police departments. The Westfield Police Department had operated for decades with minimal external scrutiny, allowing problematic officers like Stevens to continue their misconduct without meaningful consequences. The new Civilian Review Board established after the case provided an independent mechanism for investigating complaints and recommending disciplinary action. Training reforms implemented in the wake of the case focused heavily on de-escalation techniques and implicit bias awareness. Officers were required to complete 40 hours of additional training annually, with a significant portion dedicated to understanding constitutional rights and proper police procedures. The department also implemented new policies requiring supervisors to review body camera footage from all traffic stops involving arrests or use of force. Data collection and analysis became a priority for the reformed police department. Officers' stop patterns were now regularly monitored for signs of racial bias, and those showing statistical anomalies were flagged for additional review and training. This data-driven approach helped identify potential problems before they escalated into lawsuits or community incidents. The incident had lasting effects on Judge Washington's judicial philosophy as well. She became more skeptical of prosecutorial claims and more willing to exclude evidence obtained through questionable police tactics. Defense attorneys began citing her case when arguing that their clients had been subjected to similar misconduct, and her personal experience gave weight to their arguments in ways that abstract legal principles could not. Young lawyers and law students frequently asked Judge Washington about the experience and how it changed her approach to the law. She would tell them that experiencing injustice firsthand had made her a better judge, more attuned to the real-world consequences of legal decisions, and more committed to ensuring that the law protected everyone equally, regardless of their race or social status. The case became a frequent topic of discussion in legal ethics courses, where professors used it to explore questions about judicial conduct and professional responsibility. Should judges who experience police misconduct recuse themselves from related cases? How should personal experience influence judicial decision-making? These questions had no easy answers, but Judge Washington's case provided a concrete example for students to analyze and debate. 5 years after the incident, Judge Washington was appointed to serve on a federal commission studying police reform and community relations. Her unique perspective as both a victim of misconduct and a federal judge made her an invaluable voice in discussions about systemic change. The Commission's recommendations influenced federal policy and funding priorities, extending the impact of her case far beyond the borders of Westfield. The neighborhood where the incident occurred also experienced lasting changes. Property values initially dipped as the negative publicity made some potential buyers hesitant to move to an area associated with police misconduct. However, the comprehensive reforms implemented by the city eventually restored confidence, and the area became known as a model for community police relations rather than a symbol of racial bias. Officer Rodriguez, who had witnessed Stevens' misconduct but failed to intervene, struggled with guilt and regret for years after the incident. She eventually left law enforcement and became a social worker, dedicating her career to helping victims of violence and discrimination. She frequently spoke about the importance of speaking up when witnessing wrongdoing, using her own failure as a cautionary tale for others in positions of authority. The body camera footage from the incident was used in police academies across the country as an example of how not to conduct a traffic stop. Instructors would pause the video at key moments to ask cadets what they would do differently and how the situation could have been de-escalated. The footage became one of the most widely viewed training materials in law enforcement education. Sergeant Palmer's demotion and suspension had ripple effects throughout his family and social circle. He had been well respected in his community and had served as a volunteer coach for youth sports. After the incident, he was asked to step down from these volunteer positions, and his reputation never fully recovered. He eventually transferred to a smaller police department in a rural area, where he completed his career without further incident, but never advanced beyond his reduced rank. The civil rights attorneys who represented Judge Washington used the case to build a practice focused on police misconduct litigation. The high-profile nature of the case and the substantial damages award attracted other victims of police abuse, leading to additional successful lawsuits against departments throughout the region. The precedent set by Judge Washington's case made it easier for other victims to obtain justice and compensation. Community activists used the case as a rallying point for broader police reform efforts. They organized regular meetings to monitor the implementation of the reforms promised after the verdict, ensuring that the changes were substantive rather than merely cosmetic. The sustained community pressure helped maintain momentum for reform, even as public attention eventually shifted to other issues. The incident also influenced how other federal judges approached cases involving law enforcement. Judges, who had previously given police testimony the benefit of the doubt, became more willing to question inconsistencies and demand corroborating evidence. The knowledge that even a federal judge could be subjected to such treatment made them more receptive to claims of police misconduct from ordinary citizens. Judge Washington's experience resonated particularly strongly with other professional women of color, who saw in her story a reflection of their own experiences with discrimination and bias. She received invitations to speak at conferences for female lawyers, judges, and executives, where she discussed not only the legal aspects of her case, but also the personal resilience required to challenge powerful institutions. The financial cost of the case to the city included not only the damages and legal fees, but also the expense of implementing comprehensive reforms, new training programs, civilian oversight mechanisms, and data collection systems required significant ongoing investment. However, city officials calculated that these costs were far less than what they might have faced if the pattern of misconduct had continued unchecked. The case also highlighted the importance of having diverse leadership in police departments. The Westfield Police Department's command staff had been overwhelmingly white and male for decades, contributing to a culture that tolerated or overlooked racial bias. Efforts to recruit and promote officers from diverse backgrounds became a priority in the reform process, though progress was slow and met with resistance from some quarters. Insurance companies that provided liability coverage for police departments began requiring more stringent training and oversight as a condition of coverage. The large payout in Judge Washington's case served as a wake-up call for the insurance industry, leading to higher premiums for departments with poor track records and incentives for those that demonstrated commitment to reform. The psychological impact on Judge Washington was profound and lasting. Despite her legal victory and the reforms that followed, she continued to experience anxiety during routine encounters with law enforcement. The incident had shattered her sense of security and forced her to confront the reality that her professional status and legal knowledge could not protect her from racial bias and abuse of power. Years later, when asked about the most important lesson from her experience, Judge Washington would say that it demonstrated both the fragility and the resilience of justice. The system had failed her initially, allowing racial bias to override constitutional rights and professional courtesy. But ultimately, that same system provided mechanisms for accountability and change, proving that progress was possible even in the face of entrenched discrimination. The case continued to influence legal education and professional development long after the initial verdict. Law schools incorporated it into their curricula as an example of how personal experience can inform legal practice, while police academies used it to teach about the consequences of misconduct. The incident became a touchstone for discussions about race, power, and accountability in American society. What do you think about the long-term impact of Judge Washington's decision to fight back? Let me know in the comments whether you believe these kinds of cases actually lead to meaningful change. So there you have it, a simple traffic stop on Maple Street that turned into an $830,000 lesson about the cost of racism and abuse of power. Judge Angela Washington went from driving 2 miles over the speed limit to becoming the center of a landmark civil rights case that changed an entire police department and influenced law enforcement practices across the country. Officer Michael Stevens thought he could humiliate a successful black woman with impunity. He was wrong. His moment of racial bias cost him his career, his reputation, and his future. The city of Westfield learned that tolerating discrimination comes with a price tag they could barely afford. And the legal system proved that sometimes, just sometimes, accountability actually works. But this story isn't really about money or even justice for one person. It's about the courage it takes to stand up when you're being treated unfairly, even when you know fighting back will be difficult and exhausting. Judge Washington could have quietly accepted the mistreatment and moved on with her life. Instead, she chose to fight, not just for herself, but for everyone who comes after her. The reforms implemented in Westfield, the training changes in police departments nationwide, the increased awareness among federal judges about police misconduct. These changes happened because one woman refused to let racism win. Her case became a blueprint for holding law enforcement accountable and a reminder that no one, regardless of their race or background, should have to endure what she experienced that Tuesday afternoon. What you just witnessed was devastating, but the case on the right takes everything to another level, a situation so extreme it left even veteran investigators stunned.